Today at the National Press Club, the Shadow Minister for Defence, James Paterson. Senator Paterson will deliver his defence strategy in reply, examining the strategy pursued by the government and detailing the coalition's alternative approach. James Paterson with today's Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club for today's Westpac address. I'm Andrew Probyn, National Affairs Editor for 9 News. I'm also a director here at the club. Now, our guest today is the Shadow Defence Minister, James Paterson. He's principally here to deliver a formal response to the National Defence Strategy released last week by the Defence Minister, Richard Marles. His speech is titled Real Spending for Real Capacity. But as we all know, James Paterson is not a politician constrained by portfolios. He's an eloquent, clear-thinking political strategist who has been used as the coalition campaign spokesman. This is his first address. He's also developing a reputation as somewhat of a fixer. He mediated talks between Angus Taylor and Andrew Hastie in January over the Liberal leadership. And we read today that he's been central to recruiting Brian Loughnane to the presidency of the Victorian Liberal division. He is indeed a very busy man. We will be having a podcast released of today's address later on today on our website. But please join me in welcoming James Paterson.
Andrew, thank you very much for the kind introduction. There have been previous defence ministers who've liked to be known as fixers. I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, but we'll see. It's an honour to be here today for my first address to the National Press Club, and I want to particularly thank my federal and territory colleagues who are here to support me, including Michaelia Cash, Ted O'Brien, Dave Sharma, Jess Collins, Deb Morris and Peter Kane. I want to begin today with a trigger warning, just in case any members of the Expenditure Review Committee are watching. This speech may include quotes, references and praise for former generals, think tanks and even washed-up bureaucrats. And while it is true that people like Sir Angus Houston, Professor Peter Dean, Jennifer Parker, Michael Shoebridge and Peter Jennings were never members of an ERC, personally, I think their expertise is worth listening to with respect. But if you are triggered by that, please change the channel now. I've been inspired by a speech by the Deputy Chief of Army, Major General Chris Smith, recently reported by the ABC. He lamented that in the modern ADF, there is a tendency to use language which obscures the reality of warfare. General Smith said, "We don't talk about problems. We have challenges and issues to face and overcome. We speak with unnecessary jargon and gibberish. It epitomises how Western militaries, including ours, have allowed modern managerial and advertising logic and doublespeak to pollute the profession." Well, if impenetrable and inaccessible language is a problem in the profession of arms, it's an even bigger problem in the profession of politics. We are all guilty of it. We use clunky and vague language like impactful projection, which means absolutely nothing to normal Australians. We use weasel words like uncertain when we really mean dangerous. We use technocratic phrases like this statement from the recent National Defence Strategy. Quote, "The government will progress these priorities in line with other strategic and enterprise level reforms to ensure the defence portfolio is agile, efficient, effective and has the requisite structures, processes, priorities and culture to deliver its mission." This is not just a stylistic or philosophical critique. It has real-world consequences. The main reason why it is so hard for defence ministers to get a dollar out of ERC is because we have collectively failed to earn and sustain the social licence for the defence spending we need to protect our country. Against other worthy causes, some of which are more politically popular, defence keeps losing out. If the Australian public knew how likely conflict was in our own region in the near future and how ill-prepared we are for it, they would be marching in the streets demanding higher defence spending. Instead of being honest with the Australian people about the threat and our preparedness, they are being lulled into a false sense of security. Perversely, their government is telling them that we have stabilised our international relationships and we've never spent more on defence. If that's really true, Australians will wonder, why do we need to increase defence spending any further? Or even set aside $368 billion to acquire nuclear-propelled submarines? Not unreasonably, Australians might assume that politicians who have access to classified intelligence and understand the nature of the threat would be spending whatever needs to be spent to keep us safe. Indeed, the Prime Minister has often said that's exactly what his government is doing. There's just one problem. It's not true. It's almost impossible to find a defence or national security expert who thinks that we are spending enough or moving fast enough. And the best informed among them, including two of the hand-picked independent reviewers of the Albanese government's Defence Strategic Review, Sir Angus Houston and Professor Peter Dean, have publicly said that we need to be spending at least 3% of GDP. Accounting tricks aside, we will never sustainably reach a real defence to GDP spend of 3% if we are not honest with the Australian people about just how serious this historical moment is. Research by the National Security College at ANU shows there is a strong public appetite for a more candid conversation about our national security challenges. Their study revealed that a majority of Australians, 53%, believe the government shares too little or far too little information about security threats. Primarily, it is the responsibility of government to make sure Australians are well informed about these threats. I commend the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, for at least mentioning the People's Republic of China and calling out their malign activities in his press club speech earlier this month. But too often, he and Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy are lone voices in the Albanese government willing to do this, and they are often contradicted by others, including the Prime Minister, who seem intent on reassuring us that everything is fine. Rote learned platitudes about stabilisation and disagreeing where we must do the public a disservice. This is a historical moment that demands more than lamely repeating anodyne talking points. I am not asking the government to be reckless or inflammatory. I understand and accept we have bilateral relationships which need to be sensitively managed. But the government should be more candid, more often, about just how dire our strategic circumstances are. And they need not bear this burden alone. As the ANU's research shows, Australians are hungry for authoritative insight from trusted leaders about our security environment. They don't just want to hear from politicians about these issues. In other democracies, it's perfectly normal for senior intelligence and military leaders to speak candidly, publicly, about the threat environment and their preparedness. Senior US military leaders frequently testify before Congress to candidly share their assessment of threats to their national security. They are also far more open about their military capabilities and vulnerabilities. An interested Australian can learn far more from open source material about America's assessment of the strategic challenges we face, as well as their readiness to meet them, than they can from their own government. And just at the time Australians deserve to know more, not less, about our military preparedness, the Albanese government is actively working to limit and reduce transparency. On Labor's watch, Defence effectively stopped cooperating with the Australian National Audit Office as part of their Defence Major Projects reports. Information that was routinely provided under the previous government and was effectively used by the previous opposition to hold us to account for delays in major projects suddenly became too sensitive to share. It got so bad that the Labor-chaired Joint Committee on Accounts and Audit recently threw up their hands and said there was no point reviewing these reports. But independent scrutiny and parliamentary oversight of defence spending and procurement is more important than it ever has been in today's dangerous world. The decisions we make and whether they can be delivered in a timely and cost-effective way will determine the security of our country for generations. While the new Statutory Defence Committee is a very welcome addition to parliamentary oversight, it cannot and should not replace public forms of accountability. Richard Marles should instruct his department to again cooperate with the ANAO and allow the Audit Committee to conduct its important work. Frankly though, just restoring previous standards of transparency is not enough. Australians are hungry for more candour about the dangers we face, and they are entitled to it. There is a model in Australia which could easily be adopted more widely. ASIO Director-General Mike Burgess has pioneered an annual threat assessment which maturely and responsibly brings the public into his confidence about the threats to our security. He can, and often does, say things that a minister should not. And in the process, he has raised Australians' literacy about problems like foreign interference and espionage. The ANU study has revealed that Australians seek more clarity from the government about our threat environment. So the question is, why doesn't the Chief of the Defence Force do a similar annual speech to share with Australians the ADF's assessment of our security challenges and the task we have to meet them? And what is stopping the Director-General of National Intelligence from doing the same? An annual threat assessment which is measured and calm, but also direct and honest, would help dramatically improve public understanding of the serious threats we face. It would also assist in sustaining the social licence needed for indispensable multi-decade projects like AUKUS. As Shadow Minister for Defence, I accept I have a responsibility to contribute to this collective task. I am a politician. It is my job to convince the public that the blue team is better than the red team when it comes to defence and national security. But my guiding light is the national interest. I got into politics, and despite the challenges, I remain in it today because I want to help hand over a sovereign liberal democracy to my children that my generation has inherited from a previous one. I get out of bed every morning because I believe that unless we make radical changes, we are at serious risk of failing that mission. It is often said that national security portfolios like defence are bipartisan. But there are healthy and unhealthy types of bipartisanship. There is robust bipartisanship, which includes healthy scrutiny of government. And there is cosy bipartisanship, which is a conspiracy against the public. Australians are increasingly showing that they have little patience for this. They are cynical about the major parties colluding to keep them in the dark. I will never do anything which harms the national interest. I will never needlessly politicise issues for the sake of it. I will never engage in irresponsible alarmism, denigrate the efforts of our men and women in uniform, or do anything to ostracise or denigrate our diaspora communities. But I also will not participate in the false reassurance of the public about the threats we face or our state of readiness just to avoid ruffling feathers. That would be an abrogation of my responsibility to the people of Australia. I'm also not here to defend the record of the previous coalition government. We got some really big calls right, like AUKUS, returning defence spending to 2% of GDP, and massive investment in cyber capability through programs like Red Spice. But, like any government, we didn't get everything right on defence, as this government seems to delight in pointing out. If attacking a previous government made a country safer, then Australia would be the safest country in the world. But unfortunately, it doesn't. Only investing in and acquiring real military capability does. If I do my job well as Shadow Minister, it should make the job of the actual Minister easier. I intend to help make the case for real increases in defence spending from opposition, so the next time it is considered in ERC, it gets a better hearing. Because this is not the sort of portfolio where you might selfishly want the government to fail. I want them to succeed. I don't want Australians to have to wait for a coalition government for significant increases in defence spending. But that won't happen if we don't level with the Australian public. So in that spirit, I want to speak candidly and directly today about two of the biggest strategic challenges we face. The first is, of course, our strategic environment. Much has been said about the death of the rules-based order. I am not as pessimistic as some of my colleagues. I don't think it's dead, but it is on life support. And I am not comforted by heartwarming stories of Indonesian fisher people observing Australia's maritime boundaries. Because you don't have to travel much further north and ask a different group of fishermen for their perspective about maritime borders to get a very different view. Try asking a Filipino fisherman whether he thinks maritime boundaries are being respected. In his part of the world, they are not. In fact, their lives are at risk every time they venture into disputed territories like the Scarborough and Sabina Shoals, even within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The coercive, dangerous and reckless conduct of the PRC Coast Guard and Maritime Militia is just one of many worrying data points about the fraying international order. Of course, the PRC's non-compliance with the rules-based order in the South China Sea goes far beyond fishing rights. Its systematic attempt to change the facts on the ground by turning islands, atolls and other features into dual-use facilities with obvious military applications is deeply troubling, as is the blatant disregard for rulings of international courts and tribunals. In my book, when assessing the health of the rules-based order, we should give much greater weight to the PRC's non-compliance in the South China Sea than the respectful observance of Indonesian fishermen in the Timor or Arafura Seas. While there has always been selective compliance with the rules-based order, what has become increasingly clear in recent years is how, for great powers, compliance with the rules is a discretionary choice. Whether it is the PRC in the South China Sea, or Russia in Ukraine, or even sometimes our American friends, compliance with international rules is becoming something done only when it is convenient. We should never endorse or welcome a return to a might is right world. We should consistently stand up for our values and principles, and we should advocate for an order that supports our interests and those of our like-minded partners. But we should never be naive about it. An appeal to international law will not prevent the PRC from attempting to annex Taiwan by force should Xi Jinping make that choice in the future. Nor can we solely rely on a great and powerful friend to protect us. The post-Cold War unipolar moment is over. The security and economic dividend provided by unchallenged American military power is also disappearing. We are now in a much more anarchic international system, which is bipolar or multipolar. Global public goods, like open transit of international waters, are under threat. I welcome the refreshing dose of realism recently brought by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. First at Davos and then in the Australian Parliament, he bluntly acknowledged that the global architecture of the post-war era is breaking down. He's right. Multilateral institutions, in particular, are showing increasing signs of strain and dysfunction. And Canada's relationship with their most important ally, and ours, has been understandably altered by an unconventional US administration. But I'm personally less convinced by Prime Minister Carney's proposed solution, variable geometry, or coalitions of middle powers with shared perspectives. Don't get me wrong, in an age of multilateral dysfunction, I am a big fan of minilateral institutions based on shared interests and values. The Five Eyes, AUKUS, the Quad, our trilateral security dialogue with Japan and the United States. These are typically far more nimble and aligned coalitions than unwieldy UN institutions and committees. But every single one of Australia's most meaningful minilateral groupings is anchored by the United States. None would have any weight without at least partnering with the US in some way. And it is impossible to imagine a coalition big or powerful enough to support our core national interests like peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific without the US as part of it. So while I respect and understand why many Australians are confounded by the rhetoric and sometimes the policies of the Trump administration, the idea that we can make our way safely in the world without them is absurd. You will struggle to find a parliamentarian more enthusiastic about the US alliance than me. I've visited the US more times than I can count. I lived there twice, attending primary school in Washington, DC in the early 90s and returning to complete an internship on Capitol Hill in the late 2000s. And yet, even I recognise that we can no longer just cling to the US alliance as our only or even our primary security strategy. The 2026 NDS is right to return to an emphasis on self-reliance. Clearly, the US is not the same power that it was in the 1990s or 2000s. It may never be again. The Trump administration has been crystal clear that US national interests are their guiding light, and they are much less sentimental about alliances and values. Their national defence strategy and consistent statements from senior administration figures like Secretary of War Pete Hegseth make it plain that they expect more from allies, will no longer tolerate free riding, and that they have a narrow idea of what their core security interests are. While they are not retreating from the world, and predictions that the second Trump administration would be isolationist look crude and wrong, they clearly have less interest in the heavy lifting required to sustain international conventions and institutions than previous administrations. At the same time, power in our region is being fundamentally reshaped by a revisionist PRC engaged in the largest peacetime build-up of arms since World War II. This arms build-up is accompanied by menacing training exercises around Taiwan and unambiguous rhetoric about their intention to reunify by force if necessary. History shows us that great powers rarely amass militaries on this scale and then never use them. And when authoritarian regimes' rhetoric increasingly aligns with their capability, we would be wise to take them seriously. Australia's task is to contribute to a credible, collective deterrent effort to prevent conflict in our region and to be able to defend our interests if we fail to prevent it. Our current levels of defence expenditure are not sufficient to achieve that. We must invest much more quickly, to be more self-reliant and less dependent on the US or anyone else. Just one example of where this is critical is in sovereign production of missiles and munitions. I recognise progress has been made with the guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise, but we still have limited stocks and we are incredibly reliant on US supply chains for resupply. Even before the war in Iran, US magazines of guided weapons were low. They've just expended billions of dollars of munitions in that conflict and have back orders to restock that stretch for years. A high-intensity conflict in our own region would quickly drain our limited supplies, and we could be joining the back of a very long American queue to restock them. We must move faster on sovereign missile production while we still can. Not every recent geopolitical trend has been to our detriment. They have at least given us an opportunity to learn. Ukraine and Iran both show the power of asymmetry. Much more conventionally powerful militaries of Russia and even the United States have been at least partially thwarted in their strategic objectives by much smaller adversaries. Defenders can use cheaper and more numerous drones and missiles to hold at risk and even destroy billion-dollar platforms, as Ukraine has powerfully demonstrated by sinking Russia's Black Sea fleet with maritime drones. We are a middle power in a tough neighbourhood, dominated by a major power with far greater conventional military capability than we could ever hope to field. But we can embrace the same philosophy of asymmetry to cause them doubt about putting our interests at risk. To be fair to the government, investment in these capabilities is a feature of NDS 26. I welcome the increased emphasis on drones in particular, but they are still not moving fast enough nor spending enough. It is telling that two of the autonomous platforms that the government most frequently likes to boast about are Ghost Shark and Ghost Bat. I'm excited by the potential of these platforms too, but they both got their start under Peter Dutton as Defence Minister 4 years ago. In that time, there has been a revolution in drone warfare. Australia is yet to embrace either the opportunities of this revolution or the risks. In particular, our integrated air and missile defence is far from adequate to protect our northern bases, major cities and critical infrastructure. This was a key recommendation of the DSR in 2023, yet it was pushed off into the never-never in the 2024 NDS. Finally, it has returned as a priority in NDS 26, but we've lost 2 years and time is running out. We can navigate our way through these turbulent times, but only with a real, significant and urgent increase in defence spending. Pretending that we are now spending 3% of GDP isn't going to fix it. Accounting tricks to reclassify military pensions as defence expenditure doesn't make us safer. In fact, it may make things worse by reassuring the Australian public that we are spending enough when we're clearly not. It may even invite greater scrutiny from defence sceptics and bad faith actors who use the inflated numbers to suggest that taxpayers' money would be better spent elsewhere. At the very least, it warrants proper explanation. The Albanese government's claim that Australia now spends 2.8% of GDP on NATO measures, rising to 3% in the early to mid-2030s, was explained by a single sentence in the National Defence Strategy and Integrated Investment Program. The same sentence. Not a table, not a detailed breakdown, no raw numbers, just one sentence of narrative. It obscures more than it reveals, and it treats the public with contempt when they deserve honesty and transparency this historical moment demands. We all know that when a government or a business changes its accounting method, there's probably something they're trying to hide. That brings me to our second strategic challenge, AUKUS. I am an AUKUS true believer. A nuclear-powered submarine provides an island nation like ours with strategic vulnerabilities from a long supply chain, dependent on maritime choke points, with unparalleled long-range stealth strike capability. It puts doubt in the minds of a potential adversary like no other platform can. And the Virginia-class submarine is a generation ahead of its rivals, a far more lethal capability than we could ever normally aspire to operate this quickly. I don't think Washington is going to walk away from delivering AUKUS. It's in their national interest, as the Pentagon recently concluded. And through facilities like HMAS Sterling, Pine Gap and others, Australia is an indispensable partner to the US in the Indo-Pacific. But I am not blind or deaf. To deliver AUKUS, we have to overcome serious obstacles. There are enormous risks. The submarine industrial base, workforce, infrastructure upgrades, a potential capability gap with the Collins-class life of type extension. We do ourselves no favours by not soberly and honestly contemplating them. If we try to deliver AUKUS without quickly and meaningfully increasing defence spending, we will cannibalise the other services, as Sir Angus Houston has warned. Standing up AUKUS is like starting a fourth service, as Peter Jennings and Michael Shoebridge have argued. Yet, as a percent of GDP, the Albanese government has over the last 4 years failed to shift the dial on defence spending to make room for AUKUS. The only way to deliver AUKUS without lifting defence spending is to make cuts to the other services. And that's exactly what this government has done. The 4th Squadron of F-35s, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled howitzers, Hunter-class frigates, military satellites, Spartan aircraft, even reservists have had their days of service cut. And that's only what we know about. It was disappointing that the Minister Miles refused to provide an outline of the capabilities being cut, descoped or deferred when he appeared here 2 weeks ago. And that's before we get to inexplicably deferred decisions like where our East Coast submarine base will be. While any one of these cuts and deferrals may be able to be justified in isolation, together they paint a picture. They are only necessary because this government is trying to deliver future AUKUS capability on a pre-AUKUS defence budget. That means cutting capability, which was in many cases set to arrive in the near future, for capability that won't be received for years. What's worse are the cuts to sustainment and capability upgrade budgets, which undermine current capabilities. And while the government solemnly repeats the mantra that the 10-year warning time for conflict is gone, they have a defence budget which back-ends the modest real increases in defence spending they are offering to the early 2030s outside the forward estimates. They are behaving though we have more warning time than ever. As Jennifer Parker has said, the problem is not the strategy, it is the funding. And as Richard Miles has said, strategy without money is just hot air. As our European friends remind us, if a crisis occurs unexpectedly and you have failed to build a defence industry and capability in peacetime, it cannot just be turned on demand. It takes years to build. I do not agree with the harshest AUKUS critics who believe that the Virginia-class submarines will never arrive or that there are simple and easy alternatives to just purchase off the shelf. There is no special aisle at Aldi where you can just pick up a submarine on a dry dock that was built without an order, just hoping for a buyer. Nor do I believe that we can responsibly and sustainably pursue a Plan B alternative submarine. We are flat out procuring nuclear-propelled submarines as it is. We cannot simultaneously pursue any more alternatives. But there are supplementary capabilities that we should explore acquiring, which may help fill any capability gaps that arise. A nuclear-powered submarine does many things, but one of the most important is long-range stealth strike. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz shows how events a long way from Australia can have profound impacts on our economic and national security. Our primary security threat is not an invasion of our homeland. It is coercion leveraging our supply chain vulnerabilities. If we think the closure of the Hormuz has been uncomfortable, just imagine a scenario where the Straits of Malacca are. Australia must have the ability to deter coercion like this. I do not believe it is responsible to run a defence procurement process from opposition. We simply do not have the resources to run it outside government. Anthony Albanese learned this the hard way. As opposition leader, speaking to the Lowy Institute just months before the 2022 election, he promised to fit the Collins-class submarines with Tomahawk missiles. There was just a minor problem, as Labor later discovered in government. The type of Tomahawk that could be deployed on Collins ceased production a decade earlier, and retrofitting it to deliver them would be prohibitively costly. So I will not make the same mistake and promise on behalf of the opposition to purchase a particular platform or munition lightly. But I am calling on the government to consider other supplementary capabilities that could deliver similar long-range stealth strike capability. One example, suggested by experts like Peter Jennings, Marcus Hellier and Michael Shoebridge of Strategic Analysis Australia, is the B-21 radar. In a paper for the Institute of Public Affairs in 2024, they suggested Australia should examine acquiring a fleet of B-21s. It's a maturing design, scheduled to enter service next year for the US Air Force. Its reported cost, while certainly not cheap, is more affordable than a nuclear submarine. It also requires a much smaller crew to operate. Its reported range is impressive and it can carry a significant payload. Now, I realise, in an age of missiles and drones, another US origin, expensive, crewed platform seems incongruous with the lessons of Ukraine and Iran. But Australia's geography is different. Our primary theatres for potential conflict are thousands of kilometres away. B-21s operating at altitude means it is not as vulnerable to the kinds of cheap capabilities being fielded in Ukraine. There will always be a likely need for crewed capabilities alongside autonomous ones. Now, it's not yet clear whether the US would be willing to share the B-21 with Australia or how we would fit into their production schedule. However, they did export the F-35A to Australia, and if they are willing to share the crown jewel of the US Navy, a nuclear submarine, we are better placed to ask than any other ally. Now, to be clear, B-21s were not recommended by the DSR, but that was 3 years ago, before President Trump was elected for his second term. Since then, our strategic environment has only deteriorated further, and concerns about a capability gap have grown louder. I'm not here banging the lectern, demanding the government place an order tomorrow. I'm not even saying that a future coalition government would buy them, but I am asking the government to take a careful second look at this. Only the government can know whether the RAF is well placed to acquire these planes and to put them into service. Perhaps there are good reasons why a B-21 does not work for Australia. If that is the case, I hope the government is very closely examining other similar options which could fill this serious potential capability gap. Because I do not want Australia to enter the moment of maximum peril in the late 2020s and early 2030s without this critical deterrent capability. It is the honour of my life to be the Shadow Minister for Defence. Every area of public policy is important. When we get it wrong, there are real consequences. If we get our tax policy wrong, that's not good, but it's not existential. If we get our defence policy wrong, it is. Future generations will harshly judge us if we don't get the big calls right now. I'm passionate about this portfolio because it matters. It is real. It will determine whether we can preserve our way of life or not. Our men and women in uniform are on the front line of defending our way of life every day. The very least we owe them, and every Australian, is the honest truth about the dangers we face and our best efforts to equip them for it. I look forward to holding the government to account in the defence portfolio, including its Senate estimates, to deliver the Defence Force Australia urgently needs. Thank you.
Senator, before we take questions from the floor, let me drag you back to AUKUS. How much damage do you think Donald Trump has done to the social licence required for AUKUS, and also damage done to the American alliance?
We can clearly see from published opinion polling that Australians and other American allies are more sceptical about their alliance with the United States than they have been in any other recent moment of history, even going back to the invasion of the Iraq War, which was another test of the alliance here in Australia and with European allies as well. So there's no question that a US administration which is not constrained by convention, which is willing to do things that previous administrations would not, has an impact on public support for the alliance. And I think it's incumbent on political leaders to honestly accept that and recognise that and not try to pretend otherwise. But I don't think it changes the fundamentals of the alliance. The fundamentals of the alliance are based on shared values with the American people and the Australian people. I don't think that's changed. And they're based on our fundamental interests, and they are as aligned today as they ever have been, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. The relationship between the United States goes far beyond just the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President. It is multi-layered at every level of the bureaucracy of the Defence Force and the intelligence community, and I have no reason to believe, based on my visits to the United States, based on my discussions with our intelligence and security establishment, that that has been interrupted in any way, shape or form. So I think it is still fundamentally sound, but we have to recognise it's having an impact on public opinion.
Right, first question, Tess Economy from AAP.
Thank you very much for your speech today, Senator. You touched on the need for public scrutiny. Are you prepared to commit the coalition to greater transparency measures? And what safeguards do you think can be put in place to ensure the new Defence Committee does not replace public accountability?
It's a really good question, and I am an enthusiastic supporter of a new Statutory Defence Committee because I have served on and chaired the Intelligence and Security Committee, and I've seen how in a secure classified environment parliamentarians can provide robust oversight of the intelligence community away from the cameras and away from partisanship. And I think that will help in the defence community too, but it cannot be a replacement for public scrutiny. When I turn up to Senate estimates in a couple of weeks' time, I do not want to hear either the brass or the bureaucracy saying, well, Senator, we can only answer that question in the Statutory Defence Committee behind closed doors, because an important part of accountability is being seen to engage in accountability. An important part of transparency is it's not just for the club of insiders and politicians, it's for the public too. And so that's what I'll be demanding of this government, and should we have the honour of returning to government in the future, that's what I would expect too.
And oppositions usually do talk about transparency when they're not in government. Just going back to the first part of my question, would you be committing, should the coalition be elected at the next election, to ensure that there are greater transparency measures?
Yes, at the very least, we should go back to what the previous coalition government did, which was cooperate with the Australian National Audit Office so that they could assess defence major projects. It was sometimes uncomfortable, it was sometimes embarrassing, but it facilitated a useful and informed public debate about our defence capabilities, which we are not having right now because this government has stopped doing it.
Thank you.
Next question, Ben Packham from The Australian.
Thanks, Senator Paterson. Criticising your predecessors par for the course in politics. The Coalition did it, Labor does it. So if I could just take you to some of the criticisms that they make of the Coalition. They point to the massive over-programming of the defence budget under the Coalition. I think it was some 40%, which means that there was a whole range of capabilities in your investment plan that did not have money against them. Secondly, they also point to China's massive military expansion, that began under the Coalition, and the Coalition didn't respond by increasing defence funding at that time. They also point to the sort of conga line of Coalition defence ministers and defence industry ministers as well. So, do they have some points here? Do you acknowledge that the Coalition made some pretty substantial mistakes in the portfolio?
Ben, as I said, my purpose is not to defend a government that is now 4 years in the rearview mirror, and by the time we get to the next election, will be 6 years in the rearview mirror. I conceded in my speech that it did make some mistakes, but since you've raised it, in the defence of the former government, one thing it did do is restore defence spending to 2% of GDP. It inherited defence spending at 1.5-0.8% of GDP, the lowest level since 1938, and it responded to the change in the PRC by increasing defence spending to 2% of GDP. Now, we know more things now about the PRC's capabilities and intentions, and it demands even further increases of GDP. And might I add, we know more things about the United States and its capabilities and intentions, and that demands further increases in defence spending. My point is, Pat Conroy is particularly adept at attacking the former government. How does that make us safer? How does that equip one service personnel with better technology to defend them? How does it make our country better informed about the challenges we face? It does nothing to service that goal.
Thank you.
Tom Lowry from the ABC.
Senator, thanks so much for your address today. The US Congress in the past few weeks has heard repeated warnings about the pace of submarine shipbuilding in that country. The UK House of Commons has today warned about the pace of shipbuilding and funding for it within the UK. How worried are you about those warnings and the prospects there for Australia receiving Virginia-class or AUKUS-class submarines as expected? Do you share Richard Miles's confidence that the US at least will be able to meet and even exceed those targets? And does that at all play into your suggestion today that Australia should acquire B-21 Raiders essentially as a stopgap?
I am confident that AUKUS will succeed, but not on baseline settings, not on status quo expenditure and investment in either of the three AUKUS nations. And I am not surprised to hear further warnings out of the Congress in the US, nor am I surprised to hear them out of the UK. And I think we're doing the public a disservice just by saying everything is fine, everything on track, no need to be alarmed. I think we do need to make changes so that we can deliver AUKUS. And I think we do need contingencies for potential capability gaps, given the challenges with the Collins life of type extension, given any possible slippage in the delivery of US nuclear-propelled submarines. We need to be able to say that we will have those alternative capabilities to rely on should events get out of our control, should we find ourselves in conflict in our own region in the future before Virginia-class submarines or other capabilities arrive.
Thank you.
So just to clarify there, you're saying that we should ask for the B-21s as that stopgap, as that contingency, just in case AUKUS doesn't happen?
I'm putting it on the table as one option that I think is worthy of consideration. It has been looked at before in the DSR. The advice at the time was it's not appropriate for Australia's need, but that was prior to the election of the second Trump administration. And I think we've learnt more about the world and our region in that time, which means it should be reevaluated. And I'm quite comfortable if the government says, no, B-21s aren't appropriate, but here's this other capability that we're going to invest in that delivers a similar effect. What I think is not sufficient is just saying we don't need it. We don't need any supplementary or complementary capabilities at all. Everything is fine. I don't think that's a serious approach to this issue.
Okay, next question. Joseph Albrecht Palmer from Newswire.
Thank you, Senator, for your address. You touched on the situation that Europe encountered with Russia. And I think that crisis was made all the more worse because of the economic interdependencies of those two. Australia is overwhelmingly dependent on China for trade. They are our largest trading partner by far, and there's no one who can really step up. Any kind of conflict in the region would seriously disrupt our trading routes. I just wondered, do you think that Australia risks falling into the same trap that Europe did by not preparing the sort of, that economic fallout that we really couldn't mitigate?
There are absolutely some dependencies in our bilateral trading relationship with the PRC, but they're not exactly the same as the dependencies that Europe had on Russia prior to the invasion of Ukraine. Europe was more reliant on Russia as a source of energy than Australia is from China. In fact, we are a major supplier of energy to the People's Republic of China, but it certainly is a very large source of our export income. And there are some critical imports that we get from China, for example, precursor chemicals for critical medicines that we need to be able to take care of our population. And I think the lessons of COVID have not yet been sufficiently taken into account in our supply chain security, and we are getting another lesson of that in the Strait of Hormuz. We clearly need to do much more to build more resilient supply chains, but ultimately we are an open trading nation. We are at the end of a long supply chain. It has to pass through many maritime choke points. There actually is no alternative for Australia than trying to keep that rules-based order and that free flow of international trade open, and we need long-range stealth strike as a key deterrent capability to contribute to that.
You also touched on the US, as you kind of named the US as not really following international rules. Could you point to an example of where you think that is the case?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to give you a view on international law, but I think we can all say that the Operation Venezuela to arrest President Maduro was not something a previous US administration would likely have done, certainly not in the post-Cold War era. And although I think there's a very strong moral case for the strikes on Iran, and coalitions provided support of that, a previous administration, if they were to do an operation like that, would have done it differently. They probably would have sought a UN Security Council resolution. They probably would have sought a larger coalition, as they did in the First and Second Gulf Wars. So this is an administration which is unconstrained by conventions, which is comfortable deploying US power at short notice to achieve its national interest. And I think we need to be honest and recognise that, not just pretend that everything is normal and we're still in that unipolar moment in the 90s and 2000s.
Thank you.
Do you think that Xi Jinping wants to take Taiwan by 2027?
That is one of the most hotly debated questions among the China-watching community. I would say he's been very clear about his ambition to reunify Taiwan. I would also say that it would be obviously his preference to do that without the use of force, but he has also directed the PLA to be ready if he chooses in the future to use force to annex Taiwan. And Australia's national interest and Australia's policy is very clear and very bipartisan, which is we support the maintenance of this peaceful status quo across the Taiwan Straits, and we are opposed to any unilateral changes to the status quo. And it is one of the most critical national security priorities for Australia that we contribute to that credible collective deterrence effort along with our partners like Japan, the United States and others.
I hope I didn't steal your question, Greenie, but Andrew Green from the West Australian.
Senator Paterson, I might, if I could stretch my tenuous friendship with Andrew, ask a couple of questions. Firstly, your reaction to the announcement today of a new Defence Secretary. We've seen the Prime Minister announce Megan Quinn, who doesn't appear to have a national security background, but a strong industry background. So your thoughts on that? And you mentioned integrated air and missile defence. Doesn't look like we'll have that in place before the AUKUS rotations begin next year. How concerning is that? And can you see any stopgap solution?
Well, I congratulate Megan Quinn on behalf of the opposition on her appointment. It's a significant and historical appointment, and I have observed her through the Senate estimates process in her other senior public service roles, particularly in the Treasury portfolio. And my observation would be she's a highly competent professional public servant. Like you say, though, I'm not aware of previous service in national security portfolios. And when the Prime Minister was asked about this today, he pointed to her role in authoring the Asian Century White Paper as evidence of her experience in national security. I would say that's a white paper that hasn't aged very well. It was incredibly optimistic about Australia's relationship with China in particular. To be fair to Secretary Quinn, though, the world has changed. Presumably her views have been updated in that time. On your second question, yes, I am concerned. I do think we have inadequate integrated air and missile defence of our northern bases, of our critical infrastructure, of our major cities and defence facilities like HMAS Stirling. I think we have a responsibility to be a responsible steward of that rotational submarine force and adequately defend it, and I don't think the investment timeline is anywhere near aggressive enough to achieve that.
Anna Henderson from SBS.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paterson, Senator Paterson, as I should say. And yes, Andrew, you've thrown me because, of course, you've taken my question.
Oh, apologies.
I firstly just wanted to get a little bit more in terms of a response from you to the announcement about the US new ambassador to Australia, what you think he would bring to the role if his nomination is successful, and whether you think this is going to be a new era for the relationship between the two countries, and the time that's elapsed in the meantime has been a problem in your view.
Look, it's certainly welcome that the Trump administration has nominated ambassador. They've got a reasonable track record of getting their nominees confirmed through the Senate, so I hope that's a swift process. It is not unusual for there to be lapses in US ambassadors to Australia, and we have an incredibly competent diplomatic corps from the State Department, including in this room right now, who've done a sterling job representing US interests in the meantime. I don't know the nominated ambassador. I've read about some of his views and track record. I welcome the fact that he's a past member of Congress and will be informed about the administration's priorities, and we look forward to working with him.
And just following up on Andrew's question, Senator, in terms of the reaction to Taiwan and what might happen next, we have heard from both major parties that it's, you know, the peaceful status quo, opposed to any changes. But if there is that change, if that peace is broken, do you think Australia is obligated to take part in any kind of action?
Look, I understand the interest, and it is a fair question, but in my speech I called for the government to be more candid, but not reckless. And it would be reckless for me to publicly speculate about a hypothetical contingency like that. What I would say is that Australia's participation in any international conflict is a sovereign choice for an Australian government to be made at the time by that government, taking into account our national interest.
Thank you.
China would be delighted that the US has expended so many missiles, wouldn't they?
Well, I think, as I said in my speech, it is a concern that already depleted US missile stocks have been further depleted in the conflict in Iran, and there have been media reports that they have drawn down from their Indo-Pacific designated stockpiles in order to conduct the operation in Iran. It's also publicly known that the US has moved a lot of its naval fleet into the Middle East out of the Indo-Pacific, and I think that makes Australia's presence in the Indo-Pacific in the interim even more important.
Next question, Kim Bergman from Defence Review Asia.
Thank you, Senator. It was very interesting, very worthwhile. I'm glad that you mentioned Ukraine twice, because I note that under the previous coalition government, you were very robust in terms of support for Ukraine, but for reasons that none of us can understand, this government seems to have lost interest. If you return to government, what will your attitude towards Ukraine be?
Well, I think we have a strong interest in ensuring that Ukraine prevails, because if Ukraine loses, if Vladimir Putin is rewarded for what he has done, that will establish a terrible precedent which will be closely watched around the rest of the world. It will represent a failure of collective will by Western nations to prevent this abrogation of borders simply by force, and I'm worried that it will give heart to other authoritarian leaders, including in our own region, that our will crack over time if you sufficiently persist. So I think support for Ukraine is not only a moral cause, a just cause, it's also in Australia's national interest, and without pre-committing a future government to specific expenditure or support, I think we should be doing more to help Ukraine.
Thank you.
Brittany Bush from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Senator. You've outlined some of the serious obstacles that AUKUS is facing. You've also called for greater transparency for the Australian public. Given those remarks, do you think that the new Coalition Labor Defence Committee needs to review AUKUS to examine the weaknesses in the pact from the Australian context?
I think that core business for the new Defence Committee will be oversight of AUKUS. In fact, I can't imagine anything more important than the new Defence Committee taking an active interest in the progress of AUKUS, in holding the Defence Department and the ADF to account for the critical milestones in AUKUS, like HMAS Sterling being ready to receive that submarine rotational force, like the workforce issues that we know are there, like the submarine industrial base issues that are there. So I think that'll be core business for the committee.
Does that look like a formal inquiry, like what we've seen out of the British Parliament?
Look, I defer to the Chair and Deputy Chair who'll make decisions like that, but I can't imagine there'll be many meetings of the new committee that wouldn't be concerned with AUKUS and AUKUS delivery.
Thanks.
Well, given that, why wouldn't you have a review if you think that the Brits are going wobbly and there are people in America who don't really support it?
I wouldn't agree with those two contentions necessarily, Andrew. What I've said is that there are obstacles that we have to overcome in order to deliver AUKUS. I'm not worried about the commitment to AUKUS in any of the three parties, any of the three countries that are party to it. What I am concerned about is we are not sufficiently spending to achieve it, and that it's incredibly ambitious. And so, yeah, as I said, core business for the committee to review AUKUS, in review the progress of AUKUS, not review the concept of AUKUS. As I said, I'm an AUKUS true believer.
Corey McLeod from Innovation Oz.
Thank you for your address, Senator. I've got a question about Australian defence industry development. In the streets of Kyiv at the moment, venture capitalists are sweeping into town, tech's being developed so quickly, software iteration cycles are weeks, not years. It really does shine a light on maybe the pace of way we build and adapt capability in industry development in Australia. What, if anything, needs to change for us to keep pace with the rest of the world?
It's a really good question. There's no doubt in my mind that our defence procurement processes are broken in this country and not fit for purpose for the strategic environment they're in. They are perfectly fine and adequate for a peacetime environment where stewardship of taxpayer dollars is the number one objective, but actually the number one objective right now should be getting capability into the hands of warfighters, and I think the bureaucratic processes that we have slowed that down and made that more difficult. We need to be far more nimble, as Ukraine and others have been, in getting that capability from concept to delivery far more quickly. I am open-minded to see how the government's new construct of the Defence Delivery Agency works, but I am concerned that we are 4 years into the government and we're now doing a major MOG change as if our potential adversaries are thinking, oh no, the Australians are doing a MOG, we better take it pretty seriously.
Thank you.
Nick Stewart, Ability News.
Thanks, Senator Paterson. Extremely powerful and muscular speech. You identified quite clearly the gaps in the current ORBAT. You've also suggested that we might consider B-21s as an alternative, and that's a necessary means, particularly if there's a gap with the AUKUS sub. As you know, there is no point talking about this unless you identify, and you've clearly identified the costs of these programs. Where does the money come from? Yeah. Does it come from raised, we all realise there's extra need now. Does it come from extra taxes, or does it come from other expenditure programs? And you've identified what is necessary. You must have identified where the money can come from.
It's a very fair question, but one that you'll understand I cannot unilaterally answer today on behalf of my parliamentary colleagues, particularly the members of the Shadow Expenditure Review Committee. What we have said is we're committed to 3% of GDP in the old money. We'll have to reevaluate what that means under the new money, under the NATO standard, and we'll be transparent about that. And well before the next election, we'll demonstrate how it can be paid for. But we haven't made those decisions yet as a Shadow ERC. We've just made our intent very clear, and over the balance of the parliamentary term, we'll make our homework very clear so that it can be publicly scrutinised.
So well before the next election, we'll actually know a rough budget of where the money will come from and where it's going?
Again, I'm not going to unilaterally announce timelines for costing releases on behalf of my economic portfolio colleagues. I was previously in one of those economic portfolios. I would have resented it if someone else had done that to me. So that is up to our Shadow Treasurer, Shadow Finance Minister and others. But in good time, we will be completely transparent about what we will spend and how we'll afford it.
And our final question is from Jason Koutsoukis. Final, but probably the best question, Jason.
Thank you for that promotion, Andrew. Senator, thanks for your speech. Do you agree with the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz's comments that the US is being humiliated by Iran?
I wouldn't use that language, but I would say that Iran has demonstrated the power of asymmetry yet again, as Ukraine has to Russia. And the US has achieved some extraordinary conventional military successes in their campaign in Iran. They've set back the nuclear program, they've set back the ballistic missile program, they've set back drone production, they've demolished the Iranian Air Force, the Iranian Navy, Iranian air and missile defence, but the regime is proving resilient, and they've demonstrated that just one maritime choke point with relatively limited remaining military capability and relatively technologically unsophisticated capability, they can hold all of us to ransom and extort all of us after this conflict. And so I think that is a very sober reminder about the power of asymmetry for great powers, but actually for a middle power, it's quite encouraging. We can adopt the same principles to defend our interests too, and it should be causing pause in the minds of really serious powers in our region about what could be done to make them have a very bad day on the battlefield, as Iran and Ukraine have done for the United States and Russia.
But what does it say of America's eroded prestige that the Chancellor of Germany says that America has been humiliated by Iran?
Look, I'm not going to provide a running commentary on diplomatic relations between Germany and the United States. That would be inflammatory, as I said in my speech. But as I've said before, I think we all understand the standing of the United States in the West, particularly in places like Europe, is not what it was 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. It has been impacted by an unconventional administration. This is the world we're living in. The good thing about the world we're living in, although it's a tougher world, is it's also a more honest world. I think we have a better understanding of people's interests and their intent, and I think we're frankly less naive about what we need to do to secure our own interests. Australia must step up in this environment. We cannot allow ourselves to become victims of naive thinking that someone else will just come to our aid, that our national interests will be taken care of by others. We have to take care of our own interests.
And with that, join me in thanking James Paterson.
Thank you.